Throughout your life, you've met, engaged with and advised myriad captains of industry, heads of government and powerful world leaders, including Scott Morrison, Malcolm Turnbull and Benjamin Netanyahu, as there's photos of here. Take us through your experiences and relationships with some of the most impressive people that you've met.
On the Australian side, certainly I've had a relationship with every single Prime Minister, from and including Malcolm Fraser. And it's interesting with some of these leaders, their public persona is very different to the people that they really are when you get to know them sort of privately and out of the limelight of the public. I mean, so you take someone like Paul Keating. He was, in many respects, quite a humble guy, a very, very loyal to his friends and a very gentle guy, which is quite interesting, which is exactly the opposite from the impression you get if you just watch some of the parliamentary debates. The difficulties going back 30 years ago to the bottom of the harbour and all of the fallout from that. I worked quite closely with him and with the tax commissioner at the time to sort out some of the issues which would have created huge amount of difficulties for those who had disposed of companies, and where the issue wasn't simply just paying the tax that had been avoided or evaded, depending on the circumstances, but it was releasing all the reserves in the company so that there would be a huge amount of tax payable which bore no relationship to the tax that was avoided. We found solutions to these problems, and he worked behind the scenes, Paul Keating, to achieve sort of sensible results. For me, it was a pleasure to work with John Howard. He was a remarkable Prime Minister. One of the things that I really admired and continue to admire about John Howard is it didn't matter how much you disagreed with him, it didn't matter if you're on the other side of the fence. He always treated you with dignity and with respect. It was quite interesting, and you know, John Howard has been criticised in relation to some of his attitudes in relation to Indigenous issues, but he provided, when I was co-chair of Reconciliation Australia, he provided a big government grant to that organisation in order to enable it to continue to operate. When you look at Paul Keating and John Howard, Paul Keating introduced some remarkable tax reforms, the capital gains tax, the GST, fringe benefits tax, the imputation system. And John Howard, in turn, also was responsible for a reform which, had it not been introduced, would leave us in deep trouble at the moment, and that's, of course, the GST. So each of those two Prime Ministers are responsible for introducing some critical reforms which are instrumental in terms of securing the welfare of our society. And then, of course, I was a great admirer of Julia Gillard, who I felt was treated in a way that no other Prime Minister had been treated. And I found that very, very hurtful. I think she will go down in history as in having some incredibly important achievements to her credit. I mean, the mere fact of the Royal Commission into child abuse, this is just one of the most, in terms of its implications and consequences, is one of the most important initiatives that this country has ever undertaken, and the credit goes to her. So that's just a few of the the Australian Prime Ministers. I could tell you stories in relation to all of them, but as far as Israel is concerned, look, I've known the current Prime Minister since, I think I met him first in 1986 when he was Israel's ambassador to the United Nations. He's been a remarkable Prime Minister. You could spend hours just recounting all his achievements. There's going to be an election taking place in Israel shortly. I don't know whether he'll be successful or not. There are many who legitimately feel, I think, that someone who's under indictment for criminal offences ought not to be leading the country as Prime Minister because it's too distracting. So what is going to be the outcome of this? I don't know. And in Israel's electoral system, it's anyone's guess. I also was, every time I went to Israel, I saw the late Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin. I'm a great admirer of his. On the one hand, there are many who point to the Oslo Accords and say they didn't bring about peace, they brought about increased terrorism. But on the other hand, the outcome of the Oslo Accords has demonstrated that those who talk about occupied territories are talking nonsense, because Gaza is controlled and occupied by Hamas, and the Palestinian Authority controls, the lives of almost all the Palestinian residents who live in the territories there. Obviously, until they demonstrate that they're interested in peace, there isn't going to be a peace. I personally am strongly in favour of the idea of a two-state solution, because I think that's the only way Israel can retain its democratic and Jewish nature. But survival is of paramount importance, and if the West Bank were to turn into another Gaza, then, this would create an impossible situation. So I believe one day there will be peace, but all sides have got to be ready for that to take place. But, one of the things you've got to hand Bibi Netanyahu credit for is, the peace agreements that Israel has now entered into recently with, a whole host of Arab countries. This is a real achievement, and also demonstrates the fact that, not all Arab countries are going to sit around waiting forever for the Palestinians to decide that, they'd like to have peace.